My mother picked up the microphone and said a sentence that made the entire room freeze. "Natalie, you already have your life in Austin. This ranch was never yours. Sign it. Do not make people here think the wrong thing about you." The whole hall fell silent. The sound of forks and knives stopped. The band in the corner paused in the middle of a song. A waiter who was pouring wine froze too, the bottle hanging in the air. I was sitting at the family table, and a stack of papers had just been placed in front of me. The first page said it clearly. A contract relinquishing ownership shares in the Harper Ranch. Value: $3.2 million. For the first few seconds, I said nothing. I just looked down at the papers, then at the pen lying across the tablecloth. My heart was beating a little faster. Not because I was surprised, only because this moment had finally arrived. From the outside, that evening looked exactly like a perfect family celebration. The Harper family was hosting my parents' 40th wedding anniversary at a well-known country club in Texas. The lawn outside was trimmed perfectly. Warm lights hung along the walkway, and staff stood along both sides of the entrance. Inside the hall, round tables covered with cream-colored cloths were arranged in wide circles. Crystal glasses, low candles under glass covers, white flowers in the center of each table. A jazz band played in the corner. Waiters moved between the tables, pouring wine, replacing cutlery, pulling out chairs for guests. I sat at the family table near the stage. In front of me was a glass of red wine and a plate that had just been served. On my right, Uncle Mark was telling my father an old story. On my left, Aunt Carol had just flown in from Arizona that morning and was still talking about almost missing her flight. People clinked glasses, laughed loudly, and called to each other from table to table. The room was noisy in the cheerful way large gatherings usually are. If you had walked in at that moment, you would have thought this was simply a normal anniversary party for a family with a bit of local reputation. The main course had been served for about 10 minutes when my mother stood up. At first, almost no one noticed. She adjusted her dress, said something to the host, then walked up toward the stage. My father stood beside her. A few people at nearby tables turned their heads. The tables farther back kept talking. Then my mother picked up the microphone. She said that before dinner continued, she wanted to clear up a small family matter. A few people laughed softly. At gatherings like this, a small family matter is usually just an old story, or a surprise toast. But this time it was not. A few seconds later, a waiter walked to my table and placed a thin stack of papers in front of me, clipped neatly with a metal binder. What no one in that room knew at that moment was that I had been preparing for this exact moment for 8 months. My name is Natalie Harper. I am 35 years old, and I am the eldest daughter of the Harper family in Texas. My family owns a fairly large cattle ranch about 40 minutes outside of town, a place people around the area recognize by the wooden gate carved with the name Harper and the wide fields of grass stretching out behind it. Since I was a child, I had been used to the smell of dry hay, the sound of tractor engines starting early in the morning, and the trucks carrying cattle feed pulling into the yard before the sun was fully up. That was the familiar rhythm of life on the ranch. My father had spent almost his entire life there, standing by the fence watching the herd like it was his whole world. But inside that house there was always one thing that was very clear. Brandon, my younger brother, was the one my parents believed would inherit everything. Brandon is 3 years younger than me, and since he was very small, my father had called him out to the cattle pens every morning. The two of them standing side by side talking about the herd, the price of cattle, and plans to expand the land. I often stood on the front steps watching them from a distance, or stayed inside the kitchen helping my mother prepare breakfast. No one ever said it out loud. But in our house, everyone understood that Brandon was the one who fit the ranch better than I did. When I was 22, I left home. There was no big argument, no dramatic scene like something out of a movie. I simply packed a few boxes, put them in the trunk of my car, and drove down to Austin. My mother stood on the porch watching me leave. She said, "If you want to go, then go. Brandon is still here to help your father." I nodded and said, "I know." Then I closed the car door and drove away. Austin was growing very fast at that time. I started working in finance, and later moved into real estate investment. The early years were not easy. I worked 2 jobs at the same time. During the day I was in the office, and at night I handled paperwork for another small company to earn extra money. I rented a small apartment in the northern part of the city and drove an old car that seemed to need repairs almost every month. But I stayed. 1 year turned into 2, then 5. My work slowly became more stable. Small investment deals began to bring in profit. I became used to reading financial reports, working with banks, and looking at everything through a financial lens. 10 years passed faster than I expected. I was 32 when my father called me. It was an ordinary afternoon at the office. I was reviewing a financial report when my phone vibrated. My father rarely called, so I picked up right away. He said the ranch was having problems with the bank. An old loan had reached its deadline and they did not have the money to pay it back. He did not go into many details. He only said, "Natalie, do you understand these financial things?" I told him I had been working in that field for 10 years. He was silent for a few seconds, then he said, "In that case, come back and take a look for me once." I drove back to the ranch that weekend. Everything looked almost the same as when I had left, but if you looked closely, you could see that some things had worn down. A few barns needed repairs, the equipment was older, and the air inside the house felt heavier than before. Brandon was standing in the yard when I arrived. He was working on an old pickup truck. He looked at me for a moment and said, "I heard from Dad that you are doing something in finance in Austin." I said, "That is right." He shrugged and turned back to the truck. 2 days later, I sat down and went through all of the ranch records. The loans, the cost of feed, the maintenance for the equipment, and the cash flow from selling cattle. The situation was worse than my father had described. The bank loan was close to passing its deadline, and if it was not handled quickly, the ranch could be taken by the bank. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my father and Brandon. I spread all the paperwork across the table. My father looked at the numbers for a moment and then asked, "What do we need to do?" I said, "The first thing is to deal with the bank loan." Brandon asked how much it is. I said, $480,000. The table went silent for a few seconds. My father looked down at the table. Brandon tapped his fingers lightly on the wood. I said I could handle that amount. My father looked up at me and asked, "What do you mean handle it?" I said I would pay the loan to the bank so the ranch could stay. Then we could restructure the entire financial situation. Brandon looked at me for a few seconds and then said, "If you can do that, then good." 2 weeks later, I transferred the money to the bank. The $480,000 loan was paid, and the bank confirmed that the debt had been resolved. The Harper ranch avoided being taken by the bank. The calls from the bank stopped. The paperwork was reorganized. I went back to Austin and continued my work. During that time, my family almost never mentioned it again. There was no celebratory dinner, no formal thank you. Everything continued the way it had before. Brandon was still the one everyone saw as the future heir of the ranch, and I was still Natalie, the daughter who had left home when she was 22. In my family, there have always been two stories existing at the same time. One story that I know clearly about what I actually did, and another story told by Brandon, my younger brother. Brandon has always had a very confident way of speaking, the kind of person who says something and people easily believe it is the truth. After I helped the ranch pay the $480,000 debt to the bank, I thought things would become a little simpler, at least financially. But a few weeks later, I started hearing different stories. The first time was from someone I knew in town. He met me at the grocery store when I was visiting the ranch. He said, "I heard you are planning to take over your father's ranch." I asked him where he heard that. He just shrugged and said Brandon told people that. I did not say anything else. I just nodded and continued shopping. But that was the first moment I realized Brandon was telling a different version of the story. In Brandon's version, I was not the one who helped the ranch avoid being taken by the bank. In Brandon's version, I was the one quietly trying to take control of the ranch. Brandon told my parents that I only came back to help because I wanted control of the family property. He told them that when someone who works in finance and real estate comes back to manage money for the family, it usually means that person is preparing to take control of everything. Brandon never said these things directly to me. I only heard them later from my parents and from people around town. One evening, when I came back to the ranch for dinner, Brandon sat across from me at the kitchen table. My father was watching the news on television, and my mother was preparing the food. Brandon said calmly that he thought I should be clearer about the ranch. I asked what he meant by clearer. Brandon said if you really only want to help, then you should make it clear that you have no intention of owning it. I looked at Brandon for a few seconds and said the ranch has always belonged to our parents. Brandon nodded but said sometimes things are not that simple. My father did not say anything during that conversation. My mother stayed quiet longer than usual. He kept talking to my parents. He said that if I truly wanted to control the property, the easiest way would be to help them solve their debts first, and then gradually take control of the financial decisions. He said it in a very logical way, the kind of logic that sounds reasonable when people hear it. Brandon told them that if they were not careful, one day the Harper Ranch might end up under my name instead of the family's. When I returned to the ranch a few weeks later, I noticed that my mother's attitude had changed a little. It was not an obvious change, it was small details. My mother started asking more about my work in Austin. She asked how I usually handled real estate deals. She asked what it meant legally when someone invested money into a family property. I answered each question simply. I said I was only doing my work in Austin. The ranch still belonged to my parents. My mother nodded, but I could see she was still thinking about something. A few days later, my mother called me. She said the family was going to have a small gathering soon, something like a family dinner, with a few close relatives and a few people from town, and she said I should come home. I asked if there was any special occasion. My mother said it was just a family gathering. I said all right, I would come back that weekend. When I arrived that day, everything looked like a normal gathering. A few cars were parked along the dirt road in front of the house. Inside, there were voices and laughter. My mother stood by the door greeting guests. She hugged me and said she was very happy I came back. Brandon was talking with a few relatives in the living room. My father stood near the window drinking coffee. On the surface, everything felt completely normal. We had dinner together, talking about the weather, the price of cattle, and familiar things around town. After the meal, my mother said she wanted to talk with me for a moment. She led me into the small dining room behind the kitchen. On the table, there was already a thin stack of papers and a pen. My mother placed her hand on the papers and said, "Natalie, I think we should clear up one thing before everything becomes complicated." I looked at the papers, and then at my mother. She said, "Brandon believes that if you truly only want to help the family, then signing a document giving up ownership of the ranch would make everyone feel more comfortable." She said it as if it were a reasonable solution for everyone. She said she only wanted to avoid misunderstandings in the family. I stood there for a few seconds looking at the papers on the table. The sound of people talking in the living room was still drifting into the room. Brandon was out there too. The family gathering my mother had talked about turned out to have another purpose. And that purpose was to turn that gathering into a place where I would sign a document giving up my ownership of the Harper Ranch. I stood in the banquet room of the country club. In front of me was a long table placed in the middle of the room, and on the table was a stack of contracts that had already been prepared. The papers were placed neatly, a pen lying beside them as if everything had been arranged in advance so that one signature would finish the matter. Next to the table stood our family lawyer, his back straight, his hands resting lightly in front of him, looking like someone waiting for a familiar procedure to be completed. Behind us, the room was full of people. Some were relatives, some were old friends of my parents, some were people who had known the Harper family for many years. They stood in small groups around the room, speaking quietly. But when the microphone was turned on, the whole room slowly fell silent. The small sound of the microphone echoed briefly, then my mother stepped forward toward the table. She held the microphone and looked around the room as if this were simply a natural part of the family gathering. She said, "We just need to clear up one small family matter before the evening continues." Her voice was calm, like she was explaining something simple. She said Natalie helped the family during a difficult time, and we all appreciate that. A few people in the room nodded. My mother continued speaking, but because Brandon was concerned that people might misunderstand the ownership of the ranch in the future, the family had decided to prepare a document so everything would be clearer. I stood a few steps away from her, looking at the papers on the table. The family lawyer stepped slightly forward, placed his hand on the stack of contracts, and said this was simply a document confirming that Natalie has no ownership of the Harper Ranch. He said this was only meant to ensure the ownership remains with the family and to avoid any misunderstanding in the future. Then my mother looked directly at me. She said into the microphone, If you truly did everything for the family, then you will not mind signing it. The room fell silent immediately after that sentence. The entire room was looking at me. A few people standing near the back even leaned forward slightly to see more clearly. I could hear chairs shifting softly, the faint sound of glasses touching, then everything became quiet again. I stepped forward and stood in front of the table. The lawyer moved slightly aside to give me space. I looked at the contract, then at the pen lying beside it. Brandon stood on the right side of the room near the window. He did not say anything. He just stood there with his arms crossed, watching. My father stood a few steps behind my mother, holding a glass of water. He did not say anything either. I placed my hand on the wooden table. I opened the stack of papers and turned to the first page. The printed lines were clear, the clauses written in the familiar language of legal documents. A document confirming that I had no ownership rights to the Harper Ranch, now or in the future. I skimmed through a few lines. The lawyer beside me said quietly that I only needed to sign on the last page. I nodded. I picked up the pen. The entire room almost stopped breathing. I could feel it clearly. A few people even stepped a little closer to see better. Brandon was still standing where he was, his eyes fixed on the table. My mother held the microphone but said nothing more. When I picked up the pen, the atmosphere in the room changed noticeably. The tension from before seemed to ease. I heard a few quiet breaths from the crowd, as if people thought everything was about to end. I leaned down slightly, still holding the pen, my eyes on the last page of the contract. That moment lasted a few seconds. Then I stopped. I did not sign. I placed the pen back on the table. The sound of the pen touching the wood was small, but in the silent room, it was very clear. I straightened up. A few people in the room began looking at one another. Brandon frowned slightly. My mother still stood there, holding the microphone. I turned slightly to look toward the room. Then I said one sentence. My voice was not loud, but the sound system was still on. I said before I sign, I want everyone to see something. The room fell silent again. No one said anything. All the eyes in the room turned toward me again. And I stood there, in front of the table, in front of the contract that was still open, in front of the entire room, waiting to see what would happen next. I stood in front of the table, placed in the middle of the banquet room. The contract was still open, the pen lying beside the final page where they expected me to sign. The people standing around the room all turned to look. Some held glasses of water. Some crossed their arms. Some simply stood watching. No one said anything after what I had just said. I turned slightly toward the stage and raised my hand to signal the event staff. The technician near the sound equipment looked at me for a second and then nodded. Behind me, the large LED screen on the wall of the banquet room lit up. The blue-white light from the screen made the whole room a little brighter. Several people in the room turned their bodies to look. Brandon also turned his head toward the screen. The first slide appeared. It was a bank statement. The statement was enlarged enough for the entire room to see. On it was a transfer transaction. $480,000. The recipient was the bank holding the loan for the Harper Ranch. The sender name was clearly written underneath. Natalie Harper. A low murmur began spreading through the room. It was not loud noise, just quiet whispers between small groups of people standing near each other. A few people stepped closer to see the screen more clearly. I remained standing beside the table. I did not speak right away. I simply let everyone look. My mother stood a few steps away from me. She was still holding the microphone in her hand, but she said nothing. The family lawyer also turned to look at the screen behind us. I heard someone in the room say quietly, $480,000. Another person said, I think that is the ranch loan. Brandon was still standing near the window, his eyes fixed on the screen. I turned toward the technician and gave a small nod. The next slide appeared. This time it was an email from the bank. The email was enlarged on the screen so everyone in the room could read it. The email had been sent to my family. The message was simple and direct. If the debt was not paid, the Harper Ranch would be taken by the bank within 60 days. I could hear a few quiet sighs in the room. Some people from town began speaking softly with each other. Someone said, I remember hearing the bank was putting pressure on them. Another person said, I did not know it was that serious. I remained beside the table, my hand resting lightly on the wood. I did not say anything else. The screen was still displaying the email. Beneath the message was the transaction confirmation showing that the debt had been paid. And directly under that line was the name of the person who made the payment, Natalie Harper. A few people in the room began turning to look at me. Not everyone, but enough that I could feel the shift in the room. The quiet conversations continued. Brandon was no longer standing with his arms crossed. He stood a little straighter now, his eyes still fixed on the screen. My mother was still holding the microphone, but she did not say anything. The family lawyer looked from the screen to the contract on the table, then back to the screen again. I turned slightly toward the room. The sound system was still on, so my voice carried clearly. I said that was the money paid to the bank. I said I transferred it 2 weeks after my father called and said the ranch might be taken by the bank. I did not say anything more. The screen behind me still showed the email from the bank and the confirmation of the payment. The entire room was looking at the screen, and the table where the contract was still lying, without a single signature written on it. I did not leave that table. I simply nodded to the technician. The screen was still showing the email from the bank, along with the confirmation of the $480,000 payment. The room still carried soft murmurs, but no one spoke loudly. I turned toward the technician standing near the sound system and gave another small nod. He looked at me, understood, then switched to the next slide. The screen behind me changed. A new slide appeared. This time it was not my bank statement. It was a loan contract. The document was enlarged enough for everyone in the room to clearly read the main lines. A few people near the front stepped closer to see it better. I remained standing beside the table. I did not take the microphone. I did not step onto the stage. I simply stayed where I was. The room began to grow quieter as people read the first lines of the document. On the screen, there was a section clearly listing the borrower, Brandon Harper. A few quiet voices began to rise in the room, not the same murmuring as before, but soft questions exchanged between people standing near each other. I still did not speak. I left the slide there for a few seconds so everyone could read it. Beneath the borrower's name was the amount of the loan. $1,100,000. The number appeared clearly on the large LED screen behind the stage. Someone standing near the back quietly said $1,100,000. The person next to him did not answer. He simply kept looking at the screen. I turned my head slightly toward Brandon. He was still standing near the window, but this time his eyes were no longer looking at me. He was staring directly at the screen. I turned back to the screen. The slide continued to show the description of the loan. The money had been used for a real estate project in Nevada, an investment project that later failed. The document clearly listed the purpose of the loan. Real estate investment, Nevada. The project failed. I did not say anything more. I simply stood there and let everyone read. The room now carried far fewer whispers. Most people were focused on the screen. I heard the light sound of a glass touching a table somewhere in the room, then silence again. The slide continued, showing the final section of the document. A line near the bottom of the page. Collateral, the Harper Ranch. I clearly heard someone behind me quietly say, "Oh my God." A few others turned to look at each other. The atmosphere in the room was completely different from a few minutes earlier. Before that, everyone had been waiting for me to sign a document. Now everyone was staring at the screen behind me. I remained standing beside the table. The contract my mother wanted me to sign was still lying open there. The pen was still resting on the final page. I did not touch it. I turned my head toward my father. He was standing a few steps behind my mother. When the first slide appeared, he had only been looking at the screen. But when the words collateral appeared, he slowly turned his head to the right. Brandon was standing there. The two of them looked at each other. No one spoke for several seconds. I could see that my father was waiting for an explanation. Brandon did not say anything immediately. He stood there, looking at the screen, then at my father. The room was now completely silent. No more conversations. No more glasses touching. Only the light from the LED screen shining across the room and the contract still lying open on the table in front of me. I left the pen where it was, then signaled for the next file to be played. The LED screen behind me was still showing the document about the $1,100,000 loan. The room had grown so quiet that I could clearly hear the sound of the air conditioner running above the ceiling. My father was still looking at Brandon. Brandon stood near the window, his eyes no longer on the screen but lowered to the floor for a moment before lifting again. I turned to the technician standing near the sound system and gave a small nod. He looked at me and switched to the next file. The screen behind me went dark for a second, then a simple audio icon appeared. There was no image, only a small line of text that read "phone call recording." A few people in the room began looking at each other. I did not pick up the microphone. I simply remained beside the table where the contract was still lying open. The technician pressed play. The sound of a phone call filled the banquet room. The first voice that came through was Brandon's. I had listened to this recording many times before, so I knew exactly which part would appear. But for the people in the room, it was the first time. Brandon said, "If I make Natalie leave the ownership, the ranch will belong completely to me." Not the voice he used standing in the banquet room, but the normal voice from a private call. After that sentence came the voice of another man, probably the investor Brandon had been speaking with. That man's voice was slightly quieter but still clear through the speakers. Brandon continued speaking. "Then I can sell it to pay the debt." Conversations erupted almost at the same time in different corners of the room. They were no longer quiet whispers. People turned to look at each other. Some turned completely to look at Brandon. I clearly heard someone behind me say, "Is he planning to sell the ranch?" Another person said, "I thought that ranch belonged to their family for generations." Brandon stood still for a few seconds, then looked toward the speakers as if trying to make sure he had heard correctly. My father was still standing near the same spot, but he had fully turned toward Brandon. I remained beside the table, my hand resting lightly on the wood. The recording continued for a few more seconds, then stopped. The technician turned off the sound, but the room was no longer silent like before. Conversations rose everywhere. Some people near the front turned completely toward Brandon. Some looked toward my father. Others looked at the table where the contract was still lying open. My mother was still standing at the front, the microphone in her hand, but after the recording ended, she stood there for a moment. I saw her hand lower slightly. Then the microphone slipped from her hand. It fell to the floor with a small sound, but in the room full of voices, it was still clearly heard. My mother did not pick it up right away. She simply stood there looking at Brandon. I remained beside the table. The contract was still open on the final page. The pen was still lying there. But now, no one in the room was looking at the contract anymore. Every pair of eyes was turned toward Brandon. The contract was still open on the final page. I did not touch it. The LED screen behind me had just finished playing the recording, and the room still carried quiet conversations that had not yet settled down. A few people from town were turning to look at Brandon, others were looking at my father, and some were looking back at the screen as if waiting to see what else would appear. I turned to the technician standing near the sound system and gave a small signal. He nodded and switched to the next slide. The screen behind me lit up again. The new slide was not a loan contract or a bank email. It was a real estate transaction record. I saw a few people near the front step closer to read it. The document showed the sale record of a house in Austin. On the screen were the address of the house, the date of the transaction, and the amount of money transferred after the sale was completed. I stood beside the table and spoke clearly enough for the whole room to hear that it was the first house I bought with my own money. A few people in the room turned to look at me. I said I bought that house many years earlier when I first began working in Austin. I said it was the first home I ever owned. The house I bought after many years working in finance and real estate investment. I paused for a few seconds to let everyone read the slide. Beneath the transaction information was the confirmation line showing that the sale money had been transferred into my account. I turned my head toward the screen and said that the $480,000 everyone had seen earlier was not an investment. I said it was the money from selling that house. A few people in the room began talking quietly with each other. I continued speaking and said, I sold that house to get the money to pay the bank debt for the Harper ranch. I did not speak quickly. I spoke slowly enough for the entire room to hear clearly. The screen behind me now showed two transactions side by side. One line showed the sale of the house in Austin. The other line showed the transfer of $480,000 to the bank to pay the ranch loan. I heard someone behind me say she sold her own house. Another person said so that was her personal money. I remained beside the table. my hand resting lightly on the wood. I said I sold that house to save my family's ranch. After I said that, the room fell silent for a few seconds. I looked over at Brandon. He was still standing near the window, but this time his eyes were no longer on the screen. They were turned toward my father. I looked back at the room and said Brandon had told my parents that I was manipulating the family's finances. I said Brandon had claimed that I came back to the ranch because I wanted to control the family assets. A few people in the room turned to look at Brandon the moment I said that. I did not say anything else for several seconds. The screen behind me was still displaying the house sale record and the line showing the bank debt payment. My father stood a few steps away from me. He looked up at the screen, then looked toward Brandon. My mother was still standing at the front. The microphone had fallen to the floor, but she had not bent down to pick it up. The room was quieter now than it had been before. There were no longer as many conversations as there had been a few minutes earlier. Some people in town looked back at the screen once more, then turned to look at me. I remained beside the table. The contract giving up ownership was still open on the final page. The pen was still lying in the same place. But now no one in the room was looking at that document anymore. Every eye was on the screen and on me. After that night, the story did not end in that room. What appeared on the screen that evening quickly became something the entire town talked about. But more importantly, those documents were not only seen by the people in that room, the bank saw them as well. Just a few days after the party, Brandon began receiving calls from the bank. At first, they were simply calls asking him to confirm details about the $1,100,000 loan. Then came emails requesting additional documentation. I was not present when those calls happened, but I knew because my father called me one morning at the beginning of the week. He said the bank was reviewing the entire loan file connected to the ranch. I asked what they were looking for. My father said they wanted to know exactly how that loan had been signed and why the collateral had been listed as the family ranch. I told him he should let the bank do their job. In the weeks that followed, the bank began reviewing the loans more carefully. The documents Brandon had signed earlier were examined one by one. They discovered that some information did not match the ranch's financial records. A few earlier loans were also reviewed again. I was not involved in that process. I stayed in Austin and continued my work. But my father called regularly to update me. He said the bank was digging deeper. He said they wanted to know every transaction connected to the real estate project in Nevada. He also said Brandon had to meet with bank representatives several times that week. The story became clearer day by day. The investment in the real estate project in Nevada had already failed earlier, but Brandon kept borrowing money in an attempt to roll over the losses. When the bank reviewed the files, they discovered that some of the information in the loan applications was not entirely accurate. Those loans had been signed under the authority of managing the Harper Ranch. As the bank's investigation continued, Brandon gradually lost control over the ranch's financial decisions. The bank required that every large transaction be reviewed again. Some of the management authority Brandon previously held was also suspended. I heard about those developments through phone calls from my father. His voice during those calls was different from before. It no longer sounded like when he used to call me to ask about financial spreadsheets. One evening, he called me and said, "Natalie, maybe I was wrong about some things." I did not answer immediately. I let him continue speaking. He said the bank had confirmed that the $480,000 I transferred earlier was the payment that saved the ranch from being taken by the bank. He said if that money had not been transferred at the right time, the Harper Ranch would no longer belong to the family. I was standing in my office in Austin when I heard him say that. He paused for a few seconds and then added another sentence. He said, "I have to admit something. The person who saved the family was not Brandon. He said the person who saved the ranch was you." I listened to him finish and simply replied that I understood. The call ended not long after that. At the Harper Ranch, things began to change. Brandon was no longer the one making the important decisions. His loans continued to be reviewed by the bank. Financial documents were examined again piece by piece. And in the town where people had witnessed the party that night, the story about the heir to the Harper Ranch also began to be told in a different way. After that night, I did not sign the document giving up ownership. That paper remained on the wooden table in the banquet room until people gradually left. No one mentioned signing it again. The family lawyer later collected the file and left fairly early that night. I also did not stay long after the party. The next morning, I drove out of town and returned to Austin. Before I left, I spoke with my parents once. That conversation happened in the kitchen, just like many other conversations in our family over the years before. My father stood near the window. My mother sat at the table. I stood across from them. There was no microphone, no screen, no 200 people in the room, just the three of us. My father said, after everything that had happened, "You have the right to be involved in running the ranch if you want." He said it slowly, as if thinking about each word before saying it. I looked at him for a moment and said, "I do not need that." My mother asked, "What do you mean?" I said, "I do not need this property to prove my value." The kitchen was quiet for a few seconds after that sentence. My father gave a small nod. My mother looked down at the table. I did not say anything else. Then I took my car keys and left the ranch. The dirt road leading out of the Harper gate looked exactly the same as when I drove away 10 years earlier. I returned to Austin and continued my work. My investment company at that time was growing fairly steadily. I spent most of my time in the office, meeting partners, reviewing new real estate projects, and managing the investments already in progress. Life in Austin moved much faster than in the town where the Harper Ranch was located. A year passed quite quickly when work stayed busy. During that time, I did not return to the ranch very often. My parents called occasionally. Those calls were more normal than before. We talked about work, about the weather, about simple things. 1 year after that party, I signed another contract. This time, it was not a contract giving up ownership. It was a contract to purchase a smaller ranch outside Austin, not as large as the Harper Ranch. It did not have a long family history or a wooden gate carved with a family name. It was simply a piece of land with a few small barns and a house sitting in the middle of open fields. When I sat in the notary office to sign the paperwork, the lawyer handed me the final contract. I took the pen and signed my name on the last page. On the ownership document, there was only one name, Natalie Harper. There was no other name on it. After signing, I stood up, shook the lawyer's hand, received the file, and walked out of the office. The Austin sun was strong that day. I stood in the parking lot for a few minutes before getting into my car. 1 year earlier, I had stood in that banquet room in front of a contract that everyone thought I would sign. Today, I signed a different contract. It was still my signature, but this time, it was my own decision. Family can hurt you more deeply than anyone else. But your life is still something you have the right to choose for yourself. Some stories inside a family do not begin with hatred, they begin with very small misunderstandings. But when those misunderstandings are repeated long enough, they can turn into a version of the truth that someone wants to believe. In this story, what hurt Natalie was not the contract placed in front of her, but the fact that the people closest to her believed a different story about who she was. Sometimes in a family, the person who carries the most responsibility quietly is the one who is seen the least. They do not talk much about what they do not ask for recognition, and they never expect that one day they will have to prove it. But when the truth is twisted, silence is no longer an option. Natalie did not respond with anger, and she did not try to argue. She simply placed the truth on the table. Every number, every document, every piece of evidence. And sometimes that is the most powerful way for someone to defend themselves. This story is not about winning or losing inside a family. It only reminds us that sometimes the hardest thing is not facing strangers, but keeping your calm and your self-respect among the very people you once trusted the most. If you have ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect, I would like to hear your story in the comments.